Okay, welcome to all of you for this final debate of the day, of the second day of European Lab, this 10th forum. The general theme is the battle of the narratives, and on this theme it seemed essential to us that we should talk about the question of the climate emergency. Although obviously there are not a lot of other emergencies that demand our attention today, but this is a particularly important one. And many activists are noting that we've made a lot of progress on awareness of the disastrous situation we're in. And yet, despite that, there is genuine difficulty changing paradigm, changing the way we live in a sufficiently radical way to have an impact and to stop this disaster. So a lot of activists are thinking about how they should act, the narratives they can use, in search of narratives that are sufficiently engaging and mobilizing to elicit engagement, commitment, action. And we have therefore invited a certain number of people who Barnabé is going to be presenting. I'd like to thank all of you and also point out that the Mayor of Lyon, Grégory Doucet, is with us this evening to follow this debate as a witness to listen to this, and after our discussion we will invite him to speak and to react in terms of what the authorities are doing and how we can devise a mobilizing narrative on climate and how that might be able to inspire somebody who is leading a large local authority. And I'll hand over to Barnabé Binctin, who's a journalist at Society and in many other journals, the role of moderating the debate. Thank you very much, and Caroline. Delighted to see you all here. Thank you for being here in person. I was going to give a short introduction, but I think Anne-Caroline has done my job for me. She's presented the context, and therefore, to conclude that quick introduction, to be a bit more positive, I did want to read a short extract from an interview given by Alain Damasio to the Le Monde this weekend. For those who don't know him, he is an important author of science fiction in France who thinks about all these questions of the narrative. And what he says, quoting him, the great narrative of progress with modernity, with nature as our decor and a resource to be exploited, that narrative is running out of steam, moving towards an ideal of society driven by technological innovation and with comfort as our horizon has reached the point where it becomes impossible. However, the notion of progress remains relevant for me in its ameliorative dimension, the desire for improvement through political combat, and the fact that we cannot settle for the current state of the world, which must be transformed. And to think through this, we need imagination to guide us. And I think that provides a useful opening for the debate today. What should these imaginary points be to drive us, and what narratives can we use to elicit commitment and action? And also what tools and mediation means can we use? That's what we'll be discussing with our guests today, who I will present quickly before we have more details. So I'll begin at the end. On my right, we have Camille de Toledo. On his left, Neige Flocon and Thelma Dumont, who are high school students from Lyon. And on my right, Flore Vasseur. And a little later, we will have a Sami artist by video conference also. I don't know if he can see us for the moment. He can. So an interesting panel. You each work in your own way, in different ways, in different places, on creating and sharing narratives. Flore Vasseur will begin with you. So I'll introduce you. You are a journalist, filmmaker, writer, and through your work you have long questioned stories, narratives, and the way we tell them. For some 15 years, you have had a number of recurring themes like finance, digital technologies, which reveal an obsession with a certain collapse of our system, which you want to track and to highlight, turning the spotlight on those who want to change the world. In recent years, you have paid particular attention to free internet, its whistleblowers, with a documentary film, Meeting Snowden, and an investigation, Aaron Schwartz, the hacker and computer prodigy who ended up committing suicide in 2013, and you present him in your latest book, Ce qui reste de nos rêves, and in September you'll be bringing out a new film, Bigger Than Us, where you meet dozens of young people committed to repairing the planet, asking difficult questions, suing states, and coming up with solutions to combat climate change. I think we have a short teaser here as an avant-premiere, and we'll show that before we move on to the discussion. And if we could perhaps turn the lighting down a little bit, that's perfect. Plastic pollution in Indonesia. A generation is rising to act. 18 years old, Lebanon, educating refugees. Memory Banda, 22 years old, Malawi, combating for girls' rights. Mary Finn, 22 years old, Greece, providing support to refugees, rescuing refugees. "19 years old, USA, climate emergency. Renee Silva, 25 years old, Brazil, freedom of expression. Winnie Tushabe, 25 years old, Uganda, food security.
Bien, merci beaucoup.
So thank you very much, and well done. Thank you also for the volume level. I'd never heard that so loud. I really enjoyed that. So, Flore, why this film, and what did you learn there? What new forms of mobilization, what narratives did you discover in the field? Present the people you met and how you met them. I'll try to keep this short. This film is the logical follow-up to my work so far. I started writing after the 11th of September. I was in New York, and I was really shocked by what had happened. I wanted to understand what was going on. So from book to different types of media, I tried to understand what was going on, and for my mental health, I needed to get in touch with those who were actually acting. Actors, business people, artists. I started telling their stories. Then this figure of the activist attracted me. I began working on these people, doing documentaries, articles. Where I went furthest was when I met Edward Snowden in Moscow. That was a very big experience for me. And I always wanted people to understand what I was seeing. And what I saw was people who were standing up for other people. So with Meeting Snowden, I went around France showing the film in venues everywhere. I was exhausted by the end of it, and lots of people were saying it's wonderful, but you understand, I will never be Edward Snowden, because the guy has a sort of moral and mental power, he's a samurai. We're not all like that. But what I think is important is the trigger. What is it that brings change, which means we drop everything we're doing to commit in favor of other people. So I'd had enough of hearing people saying, but you understand, I'm not Edward Snowden. And that was limiting me in my work, so I decided to stop doing it. Not only is it not very profitable, but it's not actually serving a purpose because I want to have an impact. And then after a discussion with my son, who said I'd never done any films about pollution, I'd looked into corruption in politics, democracy, the big subjects, I'd completely left the environment to one side, which I thought had been addressed millions of times, and I also saw that it wasn't changing anything or very little. So I thought it's not a subject for me. And then my son said to me very clearly when he was 7, so I said, okay, right, I'll go and make a film about pollution. At the time I met Matti, who's the main character in the film, who was 16 at the time, who was in Bali, which is a nice place, which obviously, and who was trying to stop the distribution of plastic bags on the island. So she said, I thought that's a really good story to tell my son. So I went to make this little film, and then I can go back to my big subjects. So I went there, and really I was overwhelmed. Her and her daughter, 16 years old, had understood everything, and everything I'd been hearing from adults activists, white men of 50 years or more. Here I saw embodied in 2 magnificent young girls. So I made the film. And after that, I started hearing people saying it was difficult there to say that I can't do that because we have all been children. So I think there is, I realized that there was something which was touching a nerve. We are afraid of change. As adults, we have lots of obstacles. We're pre-programmed for a lot of things in a way that perhaps later generations are not in many cases. So what I'm saying is that there was something, for me, there is something of a narrative there that can perhaps overcome the obstacles we have inside us. We see in the teaser, there's not just the young girls in Bali, there are others all over the world. How did you choose? What do they all have in common? What's the common denominator between them? I wanted to, obviously, it's a movie, so I really wanted to do something special. I thought perhaps this will be the only cinema movie I make. So I thought the environment is a symptom of what's happening to us. They talk about climate, but there are other things. What's happening with climate is the same thing was happening on democracy, the same thing on inequalities. Everything is intimately linked together. So I didn't just want to stay with the question of the climate. So when I worked on Matti, I found that so wonderful that as a journalist, I thought I'll try and get some information to see if she's alone. This was well before Greta. This is in 2016. And when I looked around, I found the Mohammads and others. People who've started doing this at 13 years old and no one ever talks about them. My job is to tell stories, to stage them, to turn the spotlight on them. So I thought this was a wonderful story to tell. So why choose to tell it through film? You say it's your first movie in cinemas. You've done a lot of journalistic investigations. There's a real change there. But I'm working on other things, and it's, for me, they're all poets. There are people, all of them, who are very precise in their combats. They're alone. They have a lot of inner power. What they all have is also a very spiritual strength, although they use different words to describe that spirituality. That's why it's also called Bigger Than Us. But I've forgotten what your question was now. So why did you go from investigation as a journalist to a movie? That's a big leap and a change of tone, a change of register. I think a movie is, I love books, but when it's a movie that will be in cinemas, the film presents a narrative. It's a collective experience. Something happens. And I don't think we've ever needed this as much as we do now. We've had 15, 18 months where we've all been locked up at home. There's been no collective experiences. This is the first time I've been with lots of people, the first time I've been in a conference for I don't know how long. So I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed here. I apologize. Sort of seeing real people. And this is something we've all missed so much. So I think if we want to unite people, we need to share experiences. And the movies, for me, it's a dream. The beauty of the images, the music. You said something quite striking there. You had the impression that none of these efforts were really useful anymore. The mobilization on the climate in recent years has been based on scientific facts, which are incontrovertible, which have marked public opinion. And you have the impression that you've done this work, but ultimately it doesn't really have the same impact it used to. Precisely because here I'm going to quote one of my characters because they do talk about this. They themselves have been, one of them is 19 and he started when he was 6. 2/3 of his life he has spent with a microphone in demonstrations, suing the state, combating the oil industry, receiving death threats. These aren't people who sell lemonade after school. It's a real combat, and they are constantly questioned about their impact. They all have that from anybody who has a message to get across, whether they're a writer or an activist, is always going to ask themselves the question of what the point is. For him, it's a way of constructing himself and perhaps saving his skin. But is it triggering something in other people? And he said to me, it's true, we have all the statistics, we have all the information, we see all the images, and yet people are doing nothing. Because the main narrative today is that we are separated from each other. That, for example, the climate does not concern us. That this is something that will happen in X years' time, and it doesn't really touch us in our hearts, in our day-to-day life now. And so he talks about something very ancient, which is this disconnect from nature and from other people and from time. And this is exactly what we are experiencing, and the situation, the system doesn't necessarily want us to restore that connection with nature, with time, with each other. It prefers us to be distracted, but a real connection. Is there a history, a story that can someone else's experience really touch me? And for that, there is nothing quite like the movies. That's where that is possible. So there is a need to really captivate, to move people. I'd say more. What I found quite magic in what I experienced with these people, I don't know if you see that on the screen, is that we really went to places which are extremely broken, where society has collapsed, where people are in a state of dilapidation, where the population has been abandoned. 80% of the film is outside the Western world because 80% of today's young people are not in the Western world. Our children, don't represent much compared to everything that's going on around the world, but that gives us a responsibility when we are on this side of the fence. And what I found very surprising is that I thought I would make a film about people who get up very early in the hope that the adults... I never thought I'd make a feel-good movie. I hope it is one, perhaps, but it's not really my style. But we go to places which are more damaged than the places we live in, and we see people who are perhaps in a better state than we are. And these young people are ahead of the curve. They've understood things that we're just beginning to grasp. And it's a sort of reversal, which I love, because who is speaking today? Who is putting out the messages? What are the narratives we're hearing? And here we can reverse this, notably Winnie, who is a farmer out in the wilds in Uganda, who explains why we're here and about the capitalist system in 2 sentences. And that's what I love. I think our role as people who write and who speak is to reverse that and to go and find these people who are unknown, People who are so magnificent because, in fact, they're unspoilt by the media machine, media training, who are going to get an authentic message across because it's just direct, without any filters or mediation. So what I wanted was to show people who are acting, people who are achieving fulfillment through action. And surprisingly, it's a film with a lot of joy. You make a film about a collapsed society and you end up with a film about joy. And that's the choice that we have to make. So we've noted the date, 22nd of September. Thank you very much. So we also are lucky enough to have young people with us from Lyon. Thank you very much for being here. So Neige, Flocon and Thelma Dumont, you are both high school students in your final year for Neige and in your second last year at high school, and you're both active members of Youth for Climate for about 2 years now. I think you said earlier you started 2 years ago. When Greta put out her call, I joined directly, and for me it was I've been with it about 2 years. We can imagine that most people are familiar with Youth for Climate, but it costs us nothing to take the time. Could you explain how you ended up here and what is Youth for Climate? What is this organization? Youth for Climate is a movement created by the call for Greta Thunberg, from Greta Thunberg in 2018 with the march on the 15th of March. She got together about 10,000 people in Lyon. After that, we continued mobilizing, extending the scope of our action. We still organize marches, but now we also do civil disobedience actions and other activities. Civil disobedience, die-ins, all the sorts of different sorts of actions. You even called for your high schools to be closed or to organize lockouts. So to raise awareness of the climate and social issues, we're also for feminism, anti-capitalism, or for LGBTQ+. We're not just here to talk about climate justice, but for social justice, so ecology and social issues. It's an international movement, I think. The international organization is Fridays for Future, if you'll excuse my accent, and Youth for Climate in French, if we can say that. So you individually, what is it that struck you? What was it? What was the event? What was the trigger, whatever it was, that made you want to take part in this movement 2 years ago, one after the other, if you like? For me, when I think about why I engaged, I remember something that struck me a lot, which was that I am lucky enough to have a house in the country where I go a lot, and I always go and look at the fields all day long. And when I learned that that could disappear, that the beauty I enjoy, I admire so much, could disappear, I thought to myself, it's not possible that I should allow that to happen. But why was it you understood it might disappear? I saw that there was drought and other problems, and I didn't want to let that happen because I love this place. I love the animals that are there. And so I answered Greta's call, and from one event to another, I took part, and I haven't stopped since. And for you, Thelma? For me, it was more my parents. My father has always been very aware of climate issues, and he took me on marches, climate marches. And then when I went to high school, there was a group of Youth for Climate which got me involved, and I also have been at it ever since. You were looking for a commitment and engagement as well. And we talked about your parents. How do they react? I imagine they're happy to see you committed if they pass that on to you themselves. Neige, for example, how are your parents reacting to this new commitment? They're very open. I didn't have much difficulty getting the permission to take part in events or actions, as long as they knew what the risks were, and as long as they knew that I was aware of those risks, they let me do that. And even at home, I managed to set things up to have a bigger impact.
such as the compost initiative that's working very well, that we work on every day. What risks could you take for the ecology? The risk is a strong word. Sometimes when you do civil disobedience, we risk legal problems, but we take that into account before we go. We know what we're risking, but we do that. We decide which risk we're prepared to take. If it's blocking a company, for instance, we could risk a lot. There's some legal risks. Have you blocked companies before? Youth for Climate has already done that.
Et vous-même, on a le droit de vous poser la question ou c'est secret?
Moi, non.
Moi non plus.
You've not done that? No, I haven't. And do you warn your parents that you're doing that type of action, risky action? My parents are always aware of what I'm doing, and they know the risk that I'm taking. And I've already told them, if I'm arrested by the police, you need to call this number. They always know what I'm doing, because I say that it's not possible to do something if they're not informed. So I always told them. So civil disobedience, legal risks, that's not the same thing. But your parents are very empathetic to your commitment, yes? And that's not the case of all the kids around you? What about with your friends? Do you have debates on this? Not everybody has the same feelings that you do. It's complicated to try to get everyone to understand, to get them to open their eyes about what they're consuming, what they're buying. So you don't necessarily have to go to McDonald's, you don't have to go to Kiabi and all those shops. I don't want to impose anything on them. I'm just trying to get them to open up their horizons a bit. I'm an activist, and lots of activists are in my group of friends. I don't want people accusing me of trying to impose my ideas, though. People come to the marches, and then they don't do anything else. It's interesting the words that you use, and that when people are hesitant, they say that you're trying to impose ideas on them. What do you say when you're trying to plead with people? Well, are you vegetarians? I haven't been able to be completely vegetarian, but I would like to be. I'm a flexitarian, but for medical reasons. So when friends tell me that they eat meat and I ask them why, there's a bit of a debate, and then they sometimes tell me I'm trying to impose my ideas.
Vous avez utilisé le terme de besoin.
You use the term need, the need to try to convince your friends. So when you're dealing with people who don't agree with you, what arguments can you use to try to convince them of what you're defending? They can be scientific arguments with the numbers to back them up, or examples. It really depends on the situation. The example of McDonald's that I gave earlier, I try to get them to open up their minds to how the animals are treated before so that we can eat them, and the way that chickens are being raised in the batteries. I try to inform them on things that they don't necessarily know about. I just try to inform them. I don't try to impose anything. I just would like to give them the information to help them make up their minds. Same for me. There's also a question. Flore talked earlier about joy. She said it was a film about joy. Do you use this idea of joy to try to convince people around you? Committing yourself to fighting for the climate is something that's great, and you can meet people, and it can be fun. You can change our lifestyles, and you can find joy. It depends on the message we're trying to get across. If we're trying to talk about hope, yes, then we'll try to surf on that wave and say, that we can change things, and it's by working together and demonstrating in the streets and carrying out these actions. The more we are, the bigger of impact we'll have, and the more we'll be able to change things. Sometimes there are dramatic messages. We need to act now, or it's going to be a disaster on every living being, not just us. It's also animals and plants. And does that work when you're instilling fear in people? Not necessarily, not always. It depends on what we're saying. But if you attack the spectator, they'll start to feel guilty, and it's a solution, but it's not the best solution. You have to do your utmost to get people to open up their minds a bit, change their mindset, open their brains, their eyes, and listen. There can be, you can have hard-hitting messages, but they're not always the solution. You adapt to the people in front of you, yes. I also wanted to understand, we talk about narratives and the choice of messages that we try to get across, but we can also talk about the media. Do you use social media, for instance? And how often and which ones? Is it Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok? So how do you use social media? So we try to reach a young population. A lot of people are on that social media, so we try to do awareness raising on those media. We're mostly active on Instagram, but for a young population, we'll be on Facebook for if we want to reach adults, and Twitter too for all generations. We try to go beyond Youth for Climate France to open up a TikTok account. We're really trying to diversify our actions to try to reach as many people as possible. But social media are really essential for you. You need to communicate on social media. Yes, people need to be able to see what we're doing and how they can change their impact to have a less of an impact. Were you ever victims of violence on social media, difficult messages? Yes. Yes, we've had to manage that. Hate messages, either you ignore them or you block them. We try to find solutions, but it's impossible to debate with people when they just want to impose their hate, so it's not worth it. No, we won't stop. It's not because they want to impose their ideas on us. When their minds are closed, it's sometimes difficult to open them. We try, but sometimes these people are very stubborn and set in their ways, and we're not going to spend our lives to try to convince them. And it incites us to continue. It gives us the fever to continue. A last question. You've mobilized a lot of people around you, and thanks to you, how many people have joined Youth for Climate? I don't think we can say it's thanks to any one of us, but it's thanks to everyone in the movement, everything that we've done little by little. Everyone brings their brick to the edifice. What we want for the future, the more of us there are, the better we'll succeed. We see more people are joining us. They see us at the demonstrations, and they say that they would like to join us. In my high school, they'll say, we do something, and people will say, well, we want to join also.
Merci beaucoup à vous deux. Camille de Toledo.
Camille de Toledo. You wear several hats. You're a writer. You've got a hat on your head right now. A recognized prolific writer. You wrote Taiser la vie nouvelle. But you're not only involved in literature, you're also film videos, you're an artist. And in the last few years, you've come up with a concept, an extension of writing. Maybe you can explain that to us. Your last work shows a will to experiment new types of narration, projects that are underway, PRLMNT.
Libre à chacun de s'approprier le terme. C'est une pièce de théâtre
So it's a
dans laquelle vous imaginez que le Parlement européen
play that you've written where the European Parliament wanted to
20 ans plus tard,
automate nature. And so you're meeting young people
différentes façons d'habiter le monde.
in Europe
Humains et non humains sont à égalité.
in a context where humans and non-humans are on equal footing.
Rectifierai, alors. Et puis le projet en cours, les auditions du Parlement de la Loire,
And the Parliament of the Loire,
dans lequel vous imaginez la possibilité
you imagine the possibility of a system of representation
d'une entité non
so that a non-human entity, a river, the Loire River,
intérêts juridiques.
can defend its legal interests.
Vous allez nous représenter plus précisément la nature.
So you'll represent the nature of these works more precisely, and I'm sorry if I didn't present them properly.
Et peut-être nous expliquer justement le cheminement qui vous a mené à
Can you explain
vos propositions narratives à ces formes, disons, plus originales.
how you adapted your narrative to these more original formats that are more committed and more committing?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Je vais peut-être commencer par un peu plus loin. On va penser avec le temps des arbres. Moi, mon père aimait bien les temps longs de l'histoire.
My father liked the long times of history,
Un peu en arrière.
and
Je suis parti, en fait, le premier
I-
email que j'avais reçu,
the first email I had
1er janvier
on
1994,
January 1, 94, I was interested in literature. There was a Yubu web where we were getting emails from the Zapatiste insurrection.
marque le début, enfin, pas que pour moi, en fait, par
And for me,
disons, qui sont pas si nombreux, mais du mouvement anti-mondialisation.
in the anti-globalization movement, that's the start of the first attempt to reformulate an alternative to what went on after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was a sequence, the fall of the Berlin Wall,
Ou l'affirmation d'un
where we saw the affirmation of a single liberal democracy that recognizes in the early 80s, the Thatcher period, that there was no alternative. And then in the 90s, after the Zapatiste insurrection, we saw
des recherches, des tentatives, des expériences depuis.
experiments at the edge.
Je filmais,
And I was filming at the time, and
un peu comme tu es parti, Flore.
I went, like you did, Flore, to go follow the eco-warriors that were already around London.
Je rappelle cette mémoire parce que
And I
pour moi,
rem-
c'est une mémoire longue
This is a memory, it's
qui pour moi me conduit à une sorte
a memory of our long battle. When I listen to you,
je vois toutes ces idées
I see all of these ideas since January 94 that I've been working on them,
en fait des pensées et
and their thoughts and
de narration du monde en fait,
types of narrating the world that are of temperance, they're logical, it's just good, makes good common sense. How to welcome life, nature, how to build worlds that we can live in. And I'm struck
94 à quel point à chaque fois
since
ces propositions se reléguaient comme une forme contestataire.
these have always been considered to be transgressive and going against the order of the world.
Permanente en fait de l'ordre des choses.
We've been looking at the order of things in the wrong way around. There's an order of things that comes from the democracy, our democracy in the market, and we know scientifically that it doesn't build a future that we can live in or a present that we can live in.
Ces propositions. Donc moi j'ai documenté, j'ai fait ces documentaires
So I did this documentary
tout au long des années 90 et je me souviens
throughout the 90s, and the tipping point for me was when we felt that we were
pièce dans la
going to be putting another coin in the flipper. That's when the towers came down in New York.
que j'avais
I had gone to Porto Alegre. I'd interviewed the participants. I went to Brazil, and I was filming.
de manière assez fautive l'antimondialisation qui était
We called the movement, they called it anti-globalization. That's where Porto Alegre started. And I saw all of these initiatives, all of these very deep ways of trying to convert towards other styles of economy, more collaborative economies that were more respectful of our earth and less destructive for the world. And the logic of our states and the Westphalia that we come back to constantly came back after September 11th. And when we were trying to escape from capitalism, all of those things were just killed off. It took 10 years. It took the revolution in the Arab world, the Arab Spring, and the call of a young girl on the climate for something to be created again after everything stopped after 9/11. And I see this cycle is repeating itself when we see movements of good common sense from our citizens across the world who are proposing possible ways of life. I see that the media or the state is pushing it back, pushing these movements back to the side. They call them as extreme. And it's, for me, it's it's turning temperance into extremism that I can't understand, that I have to meditate on. So yes, the powers are trying to discredit what your message. But at Greta, at that time, her call, why did it work? And why did it strike public opinion so much and have such an impact? And it really did a lot of awareness raising. I can't answer that. It's this spectacular part of the fight that doesn't really interest me. I'm going to tell you, I'll answer your first question. The way I understand how I can't understand why we're talking about good common sense being a radical idea. That's the concern that we have. For me, the claims, my daughter is in Fridays for Future in Berlin, and all these young people are asking for is temperance, which should be at the heart of our society. But we're pushing them into civil disobedience to get their message across. With the Parlement du Loir, I'd like to talk about an important event in the history of these common worlds that we're trying to maintain, defend, rebuild. It's the legal personalization of the Manganewi River in New Zealand. It's a law. So the center of gravity changed. It was the law, so it could be defended by the police, a law. You're not against it, you're for a law. And that's what came back into my ideas. How can we rewrite the laws? How can we write new laws for the future so that the world order is organized around this common world, this common good? And the New Zealand law really interested me. It started from the Maori tribes along the river, and it was the New Zealand Parliament that said, we weren't able to defend this river, Magawi, us, the state, order, the law and order. We were not able to defend the Mangawi River. However, we recognize that there are guardians along the riverbanks and who are better qualified than us, the state, to represent the river. So we're seeing a real change in law. So we have this state, a general interest against private companies. And in some countries, that things are really dysfunctional with the power of lobbyists. But we have three actors: the state, company interests, who have an interest in what they call the progress, the developmentalism, where they want to just create capital. And the person, the legal person that is nature. And it was Montesquieu lesson 1. We realize that there's something missing in the balance of power. The state has always been focused on development, so has never protected the earth properly. And we have the proof with the Anthropocene period. Companies are not guardians of the earth either, even if they're saying that they're becoming green, but they still have to report to their shareholders, and the rules are difficult to change for them. So with these two meta-human hubris that are companies and the state, what do we have? We have what is associated with land, and land doesn't have the law to defend it. And what we're seeing is a tipping point in law now, where we have a third generation of law, the law of the land, that can establish in our law this third power, this counter power that is the earth. And some people like Flore, like you, will be the guardians of it. And they'll no longer be rejected into illegal action because they can become the Maori tribes of that river. In our developed world, we're going to have to find the equivalents. And that seems, again, moderation. It's a counter power, a counterweight. So we can have the voice of the ecosystems, of the environments to say to the state, that's enough. Your reasoning stops here. Or to say to companies, your reasoning stops here. Not to say we're only defending the land and there's nothing allowed. But in order to find balance, we need to defend what is non-human, defend in the non-human injustice, and that's why we started the Parliament of the Loire that aims at recognizing the Loire as a legal entity, as an independent legal person, independent of the state and independent of the private interests. But having said that, that has existed for the Rhone and other European ecosystems, and it's spreading. We could say that the law is often the result of capital and organizations in place. So it's there to limit the adversary. So in the path that's described by the different legal specialists that we auditioned for this project, it's really interesting. They say that the acceleration of capitalism goes back in time, the first industrial revolutions, but at the end of the 19th century, when we authorized that shareholders groups have access to a legal structure. In France, it's a legal person. Companies can be a legal person. Companies are different from the physical people linked to them, so they became a meta subject with meta rights, and then that gave them incredible rights with respect to human life and terrestrial life. So environmental lawyers who are participating in this debate on the question follow the following logic. These incredible rights that they have to this legal fiction that gave rights to companies has now produced effects. And we're scientifically living with the effects of the acceleration of the rights of capital over the rights of land. And states today are no longer able to impose the common goods or common good facing these companies. So they say, what happens if we change one parameter, one element in the balance of power, and we create legal entities for ecosystems so that even one day they'll be able to claim revenue. They'll be able to benefit from the work. So what's the law done for the electricity industry? The nature feeds the hydropower plants. What rights are paid to the Loire River for the work that it's doing? None. So we've created objects without rights and subjects without rights that don't have the means to defend themselves. So we have associations, NGOs, and citizens' movements that are extremely precarious, that vary according to each person's personal objectives. But if we had a legal entity for these bodies, we would stabilize the law, where there would be a possibility for these legal entities to say, We can pay for lawyers. We can represent non-human interests. And since we humans are very talented in creating fictions, parliamentary fiction, the fiction of representation, trade unions are fictions, companies fictions, nation states are based on fictions. So we're going to add a fiction to the world that says, okay, we'll create legal entities, elements of nature that will be able to dialogue, interrupt, oppose, go before the courts, etc. And in the Loire Parliament, we're hoping that one day we'll be able to collect revenue for the work taken by humans. So the Atrato River in Colombia, there are wetlands that are attacking the state of Florida on May 1st, on Labor Day. It's the Wangan in India, the Ganges and the Yamuna that were on the point of doing it, and then the case law did not allow it. And many ecosystems, like animal life and plant life, that will have access to the right to have a voice in this plural ecosystem and the balance of power that includes land elements. Thank you. That was really interesting. I've got lots of questions to ask, but it reminds me of what Baptiste Morisot defends with the trade union delegate for living entities, and that brings us to a very interesting topic that we're seeing more and more in public opinion. It's the question of living, to go beyond this Occidental fiction, nature against culture, and the experience that you're talking about contributes to getting rid of this duality. And we're lucky to be able to talk to Matti, Aikio, who's an artist. So I'm hoping he can see us. So thank you, Matti, for being with us. And I wanted to make a transition. Can you hear us, Matti?
Yes, yes. Bon, très bien. La connexion se fait. Je faisais cette transition.
So I was talking about living things because I think it's also an important thing, part of your work. You can introduce yourself, but you've done a lot of different things. You work on different mediums, photography, sound, installations, video, texts. What do you get out of mixing all these different formats, and what do you do more precisely with these different forms, mediums? And just for the audience, Matti is going to speak in English, I think. So just for the audience, you have headsets at your disposal to have a translation into French so that everybody understands what Matti is explaining. Over to you, Matti.
Hi. So if I understood your question correct, of course, working with many different medias, it gives much more possibilities to address different kind of questions. And because I also like to write and I like to talk, I like to do artist talks and so on. So together with that, with working with images, with moving image, and I also I like to work with multi-channel video installations and spatial video installations. So that's just, of course, to create more kind of like interesting entry points to the kind of topics or questions that I'm trying to address.
Pardon. Et donc, est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire exactement?
And could you tell us precisely what sort of subjects you're interested in? What is the focus of your work? What is it you're trying to define in your relationship with the living world?
I'm really, really interested in the concept of nature, an idea of nature, and image of nature, and how this of course has a lot to do with relationship to nature, and this kind of like if nature is something exterior or interior, if we are part of nature, if nature is something out there, if the human cultures are separated from nature or not, and this kind of this is interesting way to look into nature policies that are of course like affecting both the societies, but also like indigenous cultures and so on. And it's really interesting to try to understand how this kind of what does it mean? What does it mean when the Nordic nation states, for example, they, on the other hand, they, if there's like a economical interest, then suddenly there is no limit to how much nature can be always destroyed permanently. But then again, if we are considered indigenous people and we live in a reindeer herding, with the reindeer herding culture, so our lifestyle is much more regulated than, you know, if a mining company destroys a whole ecosystem, they just make a lot of money. But if we kill one wolf that has killed a lot of our reindeer, then, you know, I would have to go to prison and so on and so on. So that these kind of, I'm really interested in this kind of like ideological motives behind this kind of what I like to call like nation states schizophrenic nature relationship, that the indigenous cultures are often like squeezed in between this kind of either the sort of exploiting all natural resources or protecting the nature as an image, as an idea, as an image where the indigenous cultures often cannot fit in.
Et donc concrètement, comment...
And so in very practical terms, how do you portray, how do you represent this approach to nature? What does your work, how does your work express this? How does it portray this?
So I don't know. By combining, I use also quite a lot of like interviews, storytelling, narratives that are like, I interview elders from the Sami communities, for example, and I let them speak, and I let them speak for sometimes very long time, where I'm like, sometimes the question is kind of addressed very indirectly. We're like a little bit going around it, but maybe then it becomes like indirectly clear at some point that why this contradiction is so strange.
C'est presque une forme à vous écouter de...
Listening to you, it's almost like you're creating an archive, you're collecting narratives, you're collecting stories of these people directly.
My latest work, which is going to be also installed next week in Harstad here in northern Norway, I will exhibit it again. It's called The Archives of Matti, Aikio, and the Image and Idea of Nature, and why the self-determination of indigenous peoples is so crucial to all of us. So yes, I'm also constantly like collecting. It's also a bit like an archive that takes different shapes and different forms and different constellations.
Alors, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Matti. Stay with us. I'm sorry, we have a timer here in front of us and I'm running out of time. So please stay with us. Perhaps there will be some more questions for you later and we can continue our discussion. As we said, we're lucky enough also to have with us in the room here the Mayor of Lyon, Grégory Doucet. And we have asked him to give his point of view on these discussions, perhaps to understand how these narratives and these new narratives can perhaps inspire public action as a mayor of a city. Thank you. If you allow me to take off my mask. Camille, if I can call you that. I like sitting next, it's nice to sit next to him because I was very touched by the different references you made, talking about things which have inspired you. I think we've perhaps, I don't know if we're about the same age, perhaps. Yeah, so we're a very similar age, and we have similar inspirations, similar key moments in our personal histories. But you talked a lot about the question of law and that river in New Zealand and the recognition of a New Zealand river as a legal entity is a key moment for me and extremely significant. I don't think we realize quite how much yet. And I liked the reference you made to commercial law and to common sense. And when you stop for a moment, we realize that a company, which is a legal entity, exists, has rights, can do a huge number of things, can sue people, but the living things, living beings, things that I can touch, things that I can eat, don't have that legal status. A company has no material shape as such. It's a conception of the mind. The only physical presence of a chair is the officers, the accounts, but a company is nothing tangible. I studied in a business school, so I'm very aware of these things, but this is something that marked me very early on. There's a sort of gap here. There's something which is wrong. We don't acknowledge the real existence and the rights of something that exists. So when you talked about common sense, I found that very striking. Things that exist. That's just the way it is. And because it exists, we should give them rights in the same way that we have rights. So I just wanted to make a quick personal digression. You asked me what springs to mind listening to this, but although the question of law to me is of crucial importance, and also a quick word for Marie Toussaint, who is an ecologist and a member of the European Parliament, who was here 2 years ago. So Marie, she may be watching us, so hello if you're there. But the question of law for me is not just something to be explored intellectually or artistically, as Camille said earlier. For me, it is an absolute necessity. We absolutely must make progress on this. But I want to also come back to the images we saw from Flore. Something that touched me a lot is that I went to Manila in the Philippines in 2001, just after the collapse of the Smoking Mountain, which was a mountain of waste in the Tondo district, where hundreds of people had died under a pile of waste on which they were working. I saw that. I saw people in the slums. I went there to see people living in that district. And for me, it was a huge revelation to see the extent. That's mountains of plastic waste. I've never seen so many flies in my life. There wasn't a space anywhere where you didn't have flies. And I said to myself, how can people live with total dignity, smiling all day long on a mountain of waste? And for me, there was Captain Marcos, and there was that which were my inspirations. I'm going on too long, aren't I? But as a political actor, what narratives can you construct from these personal experiences? If I'm talking about this, it's because the images in your film reminded me of what I saw at the time, 20 years ago. And for me, it was the beginning of a sort of eco-anxiety. And I said, it's really not possible to live like that. So before that, I had been working a little bit with Greenpeace, but for me, that was a big trigger. And in fact, I realize that today this eco-anxiety has become something that's relatively general and widespread in the population. It's great what you're doing, Neige and Thelma, to have the enthusiasm to fight against this. But as Camille said, for the moment, it is still too much seen as an alternative, and it shouldn't be seen. And also it creates, as a politician, it also creates a sort of neoliberal reaction, an ultra-authoritarian reaction, morning through to night with the elections at the moment. People talk to us about security in a world where it's true there is insecurity. But the insecurity at the bottom of my building is intolerable. But we have to remember that in relation to the violence into which the world is slipping, it's really nothing. Little by little, we are losing the things that we enable us to earn our living. It's not just... It really is bigger than us. It really is something very important. And your political adversaries talk about this all day long. I don't want to... So, sort of very dogmatic. When you were talking about dogmatic views, that's something I hear in municipal council meetings day after day. But how do you transform that image of ecology, which is increasingly being instrumentalized? But how do you transform that image to if I could talk about what we were saying about insecurity and security in our local communities, it's because one of the challenges is to reconcile all of this in narratives which are very positive and which make people want to do things. And I say this very clearly. I have huge expectations of the artistic and cultural world because I think it's partly, there are other stakeholders who have a role to play, obviously, but it's through artistic creation that we are going to manage to switch on lights and to see that we can perhaps see our world differently through art. And I am struck, and in a city like Lyon, which is with a very rich artistic and cultural life, which I find remarkable, to see the extent to which there are initiatives being taken to show things like what Flore and Camille are doing, to show things from different perspectives. And this is switching on lights which will perhaps really enlighten us on these subjects and enable us to move forwards together. What we need is some new references, new narratives, but we also need to not forget that we also have a history which we need to be able to build on. We need to be able to say something new while drawing on our past. Personally, as someone who has just lived in Lyon for 12 years, I have been struck by the lack of recognition of our two rivers, which in fact tell the whole history, the whole story of the city, the Saône and the Rhône rivers. It's through them that we can understand what the city is. And if we don't restore that connection with our river, we can't move forward towards a new narrative. We mustn't forget this. We also need to have our roots, to have that history, and we don't have that, we won't have the future either. Your adversaries are going to say that you're like the Amish people, or with their oil lamps, or what can you oppose? What can you say in response to that? When you talk about this narrative, what is it? I'm not here to answer. Sometimes I have to answer my opponents because we have to play the political game. But personally, my aim is to tell narratives that are different. And when I'm just answering my political adversaries or the Ministry for Agriculture, saying what I should or should not do, I'm not creating narratives. However, if I explain that, yes, we have to reduce our meat consumption, there I'm actually coming up with a narrative. Obviously, I have to take it further, but what's important for me today, to go a bit further on the subject, is it's not, we don't just want to say it's not good to eat meat because it's not good for the planet. It's also because if I eat less meat, I might eat better meat, local meat, and restore my local connection with the rural world around me. And I am restoring my roots. It's good for my health, it's good for the economy. So we constantly need to succeed in coming up with these stories, perhaps not new stories, or telling the same stories in a new way based on our roots and our past. And just one last quick word. In everything I heard that stimulated me a lot, there's one thing I would like to say, which is that we have a huge challenge as regards these narratives. Two huge challenges. The first is how we link this narrative in with our day-to-day life. That's why I also have to be able to talk about security or insecurity in our districts, because otherwise people are going to think I'm not connected to reality. I need to know what's going on in the streets. But above all, this narrative must not just be the narrative of a book we were happy to read, we've put on our shelf. It's a really good book. It's different from other books. We need narratives which actually establish norms. We need to transform our daily life and the way we live. That's what we're talking about. And we need to reverse the scale of norms, the norms and standards which are totally abnormal, that give more rights to a company which isn't real or tangible, rather than to a plant, an animal, or even a human being. I remind you that goods travel around the planet more easily than people, and that is not acceptable ultimately. So we need to have norms. We need to make sure that the alternatives, and what Camille said earlier is true, the alternative, today's alternative, has to be the norm tomorrow. And to come back to what you said about law, the law in our human societies is one of the best drivers for transforming considerations into norms, intellectual considerations into norms. Money, for example, is a norm. Money doesn't exist. I can announce to you, say money doesn't really exist. It's just a convention among us that says that this has a value and this has more value, measured in money. So we've created norms which are all fictional and which are our way of viewing the, but if we change our norms and change the law, at that point we can change our ways of life much more massively, and that's what is at stake today. I am a mayor. I'm not a legislator. I'm not in parliament. I'm not drafting laws. But if we are going to get these norms to change together, we also have to talk about our daily life, as I try to, but we also need to have the artists like you can switch on those lights and guide us, show us a way collectively to change those norms and lead the battle locally and internationally, because law also is international. So we've heard all those different things today, which are very interesting. I'm sorry, it's always very frustrating to conclude when we still have a lot of things to say, and I'm sure you also have lots of questions to ask. But as we've just said, the law is the law. I'm going to be obliged to stop. But I imagine everyone will be staying, and you can ask them any questions that you have face to face. And please come and ask them. I'm sorry that we couldn't hand over to you for your questions, and thank you for your attention, and see you again soon.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you, Barnabé. It's true that it was difficult to fit all of that in. Thank you to Matti, especially, for joining us remotely. We can continue our discussions here in Lyon, and I'd like to inform you that online we're going to continue with the recording of the conversation between Camille de Toledo and Camille Louis, which was held yesterday in the investigations chamber, which is the plastic installation which Camille created in partnership with the Book Festival and with Artifati. That is a conversation that was very subtle, intelligent. So I suggest that you go and listen to that. It was also very moving. And Camille will be talks there about a certain number of things which he mentioned today in this debate. Thank you to all of you. And for those of you online, please do follow that conversation